Hello and welcome everybody to Aging with Expectation program. So today's program is presented by Reverend Dr. Stephen Koski and myself, Professor Kathryn von Treuer. But to commence, I would like to start by acknowledging our country. So the Cairnmillar Institute, where part of us is recording from, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. We pay our respects to elders past and present and the Aboriginal elders of the communities who may be in contact with this presentation. We extend this respect to all Indigenous peoples from around the world and to any First Nations people who come across the presentation. But I'd love to commence by handing over to you straight up, Stephen. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathryn. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the original inhabitants and the stewards of the land that I happen to be upon in Bend, Oregon, are the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So extend a bow of respect and admiration and even repentance um, to their elders past and present. And what a delight it is to see you. And I'm so happy to continue these conversations. And why not begin with a really, really big topic like forgiveness? And we are going to talk about, kind of dive in the deep end and talk about forgiveness. And, forgiveness can be a challenging topic for many. So I just want to begin by just saying, as you listen to this or watch this, if you need to we're going to just trust that you take really good care of yourself, and feel free to pause if necessary. And then when you're ready, resume again. I just have had a long and treasured relationship with the Cairnmillar Institute, and I just can't say enough of how important this is for me to be able to share these conversations with you. So I'm glad we have this opportunity again. So forgiveness, forgiveness is kind of tricky. Not kind of, forgiveness is really tricky. Forgiveness on one hand is, I think, really necessary if we're going to experience emotional freedom and health. Some things like anger, bitterness, resentment, are really honest and healthy emotions in response to being hurt or betrayed. But they're really not meant to hold on to. And when we clutch those emotions tightly, it can make us sick emotionally, physically. So forgiveness, I think in spirit, is actually a way of liberating ourselves from emotional baggage that's no longer serving us, giving us an opportunity to move forward. But at the same time, as I'm sure we're going to unpack, that I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean condoning somebody else's behavior, and doesn't even necessarily mean reconciling or renewing a relationship with someone. But I'll be curious what you think, but I think the need to forgive or be forgiven touches all of our lives. I remember the book where Ernest Hemingway wrote a book about a conflict between a father and son, and the father put an ad in the Madrid paper that simply said, Paco, his son, Paco, all is forgiven. Meet me in the square on Sunday at noon. And 900 Pacos showed up in the square in Madrid on that particular Sunday, just reminding us that the experience of either needing to forgive or experience of needing forgiveness is an experience that we all share. I just read a report just recently that 62% of Americans describe feeling either needing to forgive or be forgiven. But they also say that no one's ever given us a path um, as to how we do that. So, Kathryn, I'd be interested in your initial thoughts on forgiveness and the role that forgiveness plays in emotional health and well-being.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think forgiveness can actually be quite a powerful tool. It's like a process, that can benefit both mental and physical well-being. So forgiveness it sort of allows you to release the emotional pain that you might be feeling. And therefore, when you're releasing that pain, you're reducing stress and improving well-being. So by forgiving, whether you're forgiving other people or in some circumstances, you might be forgiving yourself, you're then creating space for healing and for growth and for inner peace. So therefore, you're making room for healing to begin. So it's a bit of a process. It's a journey.
I really love that idea of creating space for healing to begin. I'm reminded of an incident that took place, I think it was 10 years ago, where Dylan Roof entered a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and he killed 9 members of the Bible study who actually welcomed him in to join them in the Bible study. And I remember being absolutely stunned several weeks later when Dylan Roof appeared in the courtroom, and one by one, the family members of the ones who were killed looked Dylan Roof in the eyes and said, "I forgive you." I mean, I was shocked. I wondered, could I actually, if that was my family member, could I actually do that? And the daughter of the pastor who was killed said to Dylan Roof, said, "I forgive you because I refuse to let hate win. I refuse to let hate occupy that space in the center of my being. I forgive you so that you no longer have power over me or my feelings or my future. I forgive you so that I can be set free to love." She said, "Because I've seen what hate and bitterness can do to your heart." So I think of that as like creating space to heal. That daughter of that pastor who was killed seemed to be exercising forgiveness to create space so that hate and bitterness and resentment wouldn't occupy that center place. But on the same point, forgiveness sounds a whole lot easier on paper than it's actually in reality. And you talked a little bit about it being a process. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Sure, Stephen. So I think that forgiveness doesn't necessarily just abate over time. I think forgiveness, it's a conscious, deliberate action that you take to release those feelings of anger and resentment, feelings that you might have about vengeance towards another person or a group of people who you feel that have harmed you along the way. And indeed, you might not actually feel like they deserve your forgiveness in some ways, but it's about that inner process of deciding that you want to forgive somebody. And I think if we're talking about what forgiveness is, it isn't always necessarily about what forgiveness is, but it is what it is not. And forgiveness isn't just glossing over the incident. It's not denying the seriousness of the harm that you've actually felt inflicted on you or that you're perceiving from another person or an incident. And it's not condoning an incident or about what has happened. But through forgiveness, we can actually repair relationships if that indeed is a goal that you have. And that also can therefore be really empowering to enable you to set you free and to move forward and replace those feelings. So there are several steps that we need to go through if we're forgiving somebody. And I think that part of that starts with at first acknowledging that something has done you wrong and understanding and pulling that apart a bit, like, who has done you wrong? Why are you feeling harmed? And actually, despite it feeling a bit painful, but sort of understanding, why am I feeling hurt from this? Because until you really understand why you feel hurt, you may not really understand who or what it is that you're actually forgiving. So understanding what you need to forgive is important. And then from there, you've got a decision. Do I want to forgive? Because you don't have to forgive, but is this something that I consciously want to do? Do I want to forgive? And then from there, it's, well, if I do want to forgive what has happened, how can I reframe how I want to move forward? Do I need to feel and think about empathy? What about from the other person's perspective? How might they be feeling? But it's not letting go, and it's still acknowledging the suffering, I guess, that you've felt. Right. But it's deciding that yes, I do want to forgive, and then how to do that, because a person may not be alive anymore. You may not want to see them. They do not need to be in the room with you, but you may decide that in some moment of meditation or quiet reflection, you might visualize forgiving that person, because you're doing it for yourself, not for the other person. So understanding what you need to forgive, deciding that's what you want to do, and then how you're going to do it. And then I think fourth part in there is, how do I reinforce this? So you're not falling back into feelings of vengeance and anger, and keep moving forward and reminding yourself in those moments of peace how good it feels to forgive, and keep hold of that.
That is so helpful. That is, I mean, one, it just reminds me of how complex forgiveness really is. But part of what I'm hearing you say is that how important it is to kind of look inward and understand what's happening for you. And I heard you ask that question, do I really want to forgive? Because we don't necessarily forgive to benefit the other person. I think that's a mistake we sometimes think. We forgive actually for ourselves. It's a gift we give to ourselves. We release ourselves from being a hostage to the hostility, resentment, bitterness that perhaps is eating away inside of us. I remember one writer who said, not forgiving, if we choose not to forgive, it can be like drinking rat poison, but expecting the other person to die. If we're continuing to focus on the other person rather than how is this benefiting myself. So if I'm hearing you right, we don't necessarily forgive out of compassion for the other person. We forgive out of compassion for ourselves, because we recognize the damage that not forgiving can actually do to us. Sometimes there's a story in the Bible where Peter asked Jesus, how many times should I forgive? 7 times? And the Hebrew tradition, you were actually required to forgive 3 times. If someone harmed you, you were required to forgive 3 times. So Peter thought he was being really, really generous. Well, I'll forgive 7 times. And Jesus says, no, not 7, but 70 times 7, which metaphorically is just a way of saying, yeah, it's a process. It's ongoing. And you talked about the process, and sometimes I think of an image of a necklace getting all tangled, and how difficult it can be to untangle that necklace. So you kind of loosen it, untangle it, but then loosen it again and untangle it and untangle it. In some ways, kind of untangling that knot that can get tied around our hearts, until we realize one day maybe we feel free. So you beautifully described a process of forgiving. Can you just say a little bit more of the challenges to that process?
Yeah. I think sometimes we're human, and we can all fall back into bad habits. And if we've been feeling angry for a long time, it can be hard to let go of that anger. And so I think that's why when we wake up in the morning, we need to just reset ourselves sometimes a little bit each day, and try and remember where we're at in terms of our process of forgiveness, and the why we want to forgive, if that's our decision that we make. So I think that can be challenged. And sometimes things around us, a family system or a friendship system, can also help reinforce that. And we've talked about this, I think, before, Stephen, when we've talked about grief, and sometimes people who are grieving, they move through the process and their families are sometimes left behind and reinforcing the grieving. And that's why the understanding part of forgiveness, like understanding the process for us, is so important, to understand what's happening around us. And so to avoid moving back into vengeance and moving back into anger, we want to move forward and make sure the systems around us are very healthy and help reinforce that this is where I'm moving to now. I want to make space in my life for feelings of peace, not feelings of anger, for me.
Yeah.
So I think that habit thing is a good thing to be aware of.
Part of what I'm hearing and what you're saying, which I think is just so beautiful, is that you can't force forgiveness and you can't fake forgiveness. I think I read somewhere that someone said, you don't always necessarily forgive to heal. Sometimes you heal and then forgiveness happens. Sometimes it's about addressing that trauma that we've experienced inside, that trauma that we keep reliving, maybe even in our body, and addressing that. And sometimes that feeling of release of whatever it is we've been holding on to, we find we've been liberating for that. I often think if we've been harmed in some way, sometimes it's like holding a piece of hot coal, um, which is also like holding on to our anger and bitterness, or maybe our grief or our sadness. And I often think when I do that of just how much energy that takes to hold on to that. And oftentimes we don't have safe spaces to be honest. We don't have safe spaces to express how we're feeling. So we tuck that that hot coal behind our backs. And then I think about just how much energy it takes to kind of just hold that pain inside. And I realize as I'm expending that kind of energy, I then don't have the energy to care for the people I really care about. So sometimes the healing that can happen is about being released so that we can have energy to be the people that we desire to care for the people around us in the way that we want to care for them. That's why I sometimes look at the word forgiveness and it's forgiving, for giving love. So we actually forgive so that we might actually be able to give love to those people we really want to give love to, rather than kind of stay obsessed with this over here in such a way that it prevents us from doing that. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yes, and I love that sentiment. I think it's really important. And it reminds me a little bit about the forgiveness that you're also can be forgiving yourself, and the important role of self-compassion, because we're often can be a little bit wired to want to always do things for other people. And this is something that we need to do for ourselves and show ourselves some self-compassion. Often we can have that critical voice in our head chatting, telling us, that, gee, you handled that badly, why can't you get over this? And at the end of the day, we're actually all human beings, which is a great thing, but we've all dealt with suffering. We've all had days and moments of feeling inadequate. We've all had times of being a failure in different things, but it's actually the richness that makes us human and makes us different, and gives us some identity. So it's actually okay to honor these moments when we're not feeling on top of everything, and actually affording yourself those feelings of compassion that we often give other people before ourselves. But yeah, I think it's okay, isn't it, that we also show ourselves some of that compassion, and allow us to be part of this process and be mindful, um, showing some self-kindness and understanding that we're just part of humanity,
Yeah.
which means that we're not always perfect.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how we don't allow ourselves to be human? That I often say, it's not our perfection that connects us. It's our vulnerability. I mean, the one thing we probably all most share in common is that we suffer. I mean, what we don't share in common is our perfection. But what we share in common is that we hurt, and we don't allow ourselves to be human. We don't allow ourselves necessarily to make mistakes. Um, I sometimes say, you talked about that inner critic, and I sometimes say the loudest voice you ever hear is that inner voice, that says, you don't quite measure up. That wasn't good enough. You could have done better. And so I think you're right that probably perhaps sometimes the hardest person to forgive, or maybe the hardest person to allow to be human, is yourself. Sometimes I say, don't judge the person yesterday based on what you know today. Because so often I look perhaps at some of the mistakes I made yesterday, some of the things I regret, some of the things maybe I wished I would have done differently. But I'm looking at it through the lens of the wisdom and the knowledge I now have and the awareness I now have today that I didn't have back then. And that person back then maybe perhaps was doing the best they could with the resources and the awareness they had at the time. And it's not necessarily fair to judge that person. I've always loved the distinction that the social scientist Brene Brown makes between shame and guilt. And where guilt, she said, is doing something wrong and feeling bad about it. And we might be able to make some kind of restitution, make things right. Maybe not, but there might be an attempt there. But she says shame is doing something wrong and deciding that we're wrong. Doing something wrong and deciding that we're a bad person, or maybe even that we're unforgivable. It's the difference between I did something bad and I am bad. And shame has this way of feeding that inner critic, right? And it's so easy to get sucked into that shame spiral. And she says that shame cannot, what did she say? Shame cannot stand proximity. That if we can meet shame with empathy, shame tends to kind of lessen its power over us. And you talked a little bit about that in terms of self-compassion. Can you just say a little bit more of how we might have empathy for ourselves?
So if we have that inner critic chatting away in our mind, telling us that we're not quite good enough, or we could have done X, Y, or Z much better, or why couldn't we be like somebody else? If we started to reframe some of that and think, okay, maybe I'm not perfect all the time, but I've done my best, or I'm doing it my way. It doesn't have to look like how my friend A, B, and C does it. Or it could be, okay, I've made a mistake, but I would really like to create some reparatory action here.
Mhm.
So that way you can also undermine the inner critic. You can argue a little bit with it in terms of the assumptions that you make about how other people might be feeling or thinking as well. And I think that way you can turn around a little bit and bring some empathy in for yourself and a little bit for the other person if it's reasonable.
Before I kind of conclude there's just a story that I'd love to share that I think kind of wraps up both the difficulty of forgiveness and the hope of it. I want to think about the person who's just not ready to forgive. Um, Maybe not ready to forgive someone who's done them harm, or maybe not even ready to forgive themselves. What might you say to that person?
I would challenge them, I think, challenge myself. Why am I finding this so difficult to let go and forgive this person right now? And it might actually go back to thinking around understanding forgiveness and because it doesn't mean reconciliation. It may not mean involving other people, and maybe even just taking little steps and just imagining yourself sitting in a room, sort of forgiving somebody or imagining that state. Yeah.
You know, I think also that sense of you talked about asking yourself, well, why am I not ready to forgive? I wonder sometimes too, a good question to ask ourselves is, who deep down do I desire to be? You know, what kind of person do I most desire to be? And what support, what help do I need in order to be that person? And if holding on to that anger, that resentment, that bitterness perhaps prevents us from being the person. So it's not me judging you, well, here's how you should be. It's you kind of reflecting, thinking, you know, no, that's not the person I want to be. That that's not the energy I want to exude into this world. Um, and then looking at, well, what support, what resources, what care, what therapy might I need to release what is getting in the way. You talked at the very beginning so beautifully about creating space for healing to take place. So what do I need to create that space that I might be healed to be the person that I desire to be? I would love to just finish with this story. It's an incredible story that took place in Rwanda as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this was the experience, I mean, at, at the end of the genocide in Rwanda, I can't even begin to fathom the hate, you know, the desire for revenge, the bitterness, the anger, you know, as I think about what's taking place in Palestine right now and other places, Ukraine. Um, you know, what next? How do you heal from something like this? And there was a woman. So what would happen as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the perpetrator of the evil would be brought face to face with the victim of the crime. And there was one story of a woman whose husband was taken away and burned to death, which I can't even personally imagine. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission involved both the victim and the perpetrator agreeing, first of all, to be in the same room together. Then the perpetrator had to own it. They had to actually own their crime. They had to acknowledge what they did. And then the victim was able to state what they needed, what they would need for healing to take place. And they both would have to agree to move forward toward a new future. I mean, that by itself as a process is amazing. So this woman whose husband was burned to death sat across from the white police officer who burned him. And the judge asked the woman, what do you require? In other words, what do you need? What does healing look like for you? And what I love about that is they didn't prescribe what healing is. They didn't tell the woman how she should feel or what she should do. They asked for you, what does healing look like in this situation? And the woman amazingly said three things. I want you to take me to where you killed my husband so that I could gather up the dirt and ashes and give him a proper burial. Second, I want the judge to order the police officer to visit me 3 afternoons a week because he took away the person I loved. And I have a lot of love to give. And he clearly needs healing that comes from being loved. And the third thing, I want you to bring this police officer to where I am in this courtroom so that I can embrace him and that he might know forgiveness. I'm not sure I'd be able to do this. But as I think about that story, at no point did this woman say, yeah, we're going to become best friends now. At no point did she actually let the police officer off the hook, excused or justified his actions. She actually acknowledged, you mentioned in the very beginning, looking inwards and acknowledging the unspeakable trauma that she endured and continues to endure. And she chose to forgive. She chose to walk into a different future. And in doing that, as I look at that story, I think she was choosing herself. She was choosing not to be held hostage to hostility and hate. She was choosing to love and maybe perhaps be the person that deep down that she desired to be. So in this world where there's so much trauma, pain, brokenness, hurt, division, this story just gives me just a little glimmer of hope. And I want to say, Kathryn, what an absolute joy it is to renew and resume our conversations as part of the AWE program. I definitely look forward to the next one and wonder if you have any closing thoughts for us.
Yeah, I do. And just built on your last story too, Stephen, I think it really highlights about how individual the forgiveness journey is for each of us with regards to what we've experienced, what we feel needs forgiving, and the who needs forgiving and the how things are forgiven. I certainly don't think I would have landed with the same decisions that this woman did, and I'm sure other people listening in today would have come up with different ideas to what we would have in that situation too. And I think just a couple of points to bring home or to sort of finish on. I think that, forgiveness is a purposeful action. It doesn't have to involve the other person, right, but you can still forgive them without them being in the room. It's something that we do for ourselves. And I think important in that is that we do forgive ourselves and show ourselves some self-compassion and make room for healing so we can go on and have our new self moving forward, or the person that we want to be, as you talked about before, free of anger and vengeance and retribution. So I hope today's been really helpful for people listening in.
Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for a really interesting conversation today. So as always, we like to know how we did today with our presentation too. So we always appreciate hearing your feedback, which you can provide on our online survey. Stephen and I also welcome anyone contacting us directly. We will get back to you. So let us know what was helpful, what wasn't helpful, and please recommend our program to friends, family, and colleagues. So we'd appreciate it. And also part of what inspires us in the ALL program, because we're talking about ageing well with expectation, is also our commitment to helping younger folk in the community also. And the Big Tent program has been something that Carnmillar and Stephen has supported for over 30 years now. It's still a greatly needed program that involves working with children who've been experiencing trauma, abuse and neglect, and we're increasing the capability and capacity of people working with traumatised children. So do feel welcome to donate to the Big Tent project. And thank you everybody for listening today. We look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you very much. Have a great day.